John L. Sullivan. In the late 1800s, John L. Sullivan was the most dominant force bare-knuckle boxing had ever seen. Sullivan fought without gloves, without timed rounds, and without the structure that defines modern boxing. His fights were brutal, unregulated wars of attrition that could last dozens of rounds until one man could no longer continue. The sport was chaos, and Sullivan thrived in it, but his dominance exposed the dangers of the old system. Fights ended in severe injury, legal trouble, and public outcry. The brutality became impossible to ignore. As Sullivan's fame grew, so did the pressure to civilize the sport. The Marquess of Queensberry rules, which had existed since 1867, were formally adopted as the standard for championship boxing, largely because Sullivan's era made the alternative unsustainable. The change was total. Bare knuckles were replaced with padded gloves. Fights were divided into timed rounds. Knockdowns were counted to 10. Wrestling holds were banned. The structure of modern boxing was born not in spite of Sullivan, but because of him. His power forced the sport to evolve or be outlawed entirely. What Sullivan represented, raw, unregulated violence, could not survive in a world demanding legitimacy. The rules didn't stop him from being champion, but they stopped the sport from being what it was when he dominated it, Muhammad Ali. In the 1960s and 1970s, Muhammad Ali fought with a style that redefined movement, defense, and ring generalship, but Ali also understood how to manipulate the rules. He would clinch after flurries, lean on opponents, and use the referee's hesitation to recover between exchanges. Ali didn't break the rules. He exploited the gaps in enforcement. Opponents couldn't punish him for it because referees were inconsistent about when to intervene. The sport responded by tightening enforcement. Referees were instructed to separate fighters more quickly after clinching. Standing 8 counts were formalized to monitor fatigue. The changes were designed to limit the advantage Ali gained by controlling the rhythm of fights through clinching and recovery tactics. What makes Ali's impact significant is that the rules weren't created to stop him. They were created because his mastery exposed how much discretion referees had and how inconsistently it was applied. Ali forced boxing to define when a clinch became excessive and when a fighter was too compromised to continue safely. The sport became more actively refereed because Ali proved that passive officiating favored the fighter who understood the system best. The rules didn't diminish his legacy. They formalized the boundaries he had been testing all along. Sonny Liston. In the early 1960s, Sonny Liston became heavyweight champion despite a background that included criminal convictions and ties to organized crime. Liston's power was undeniable, but his history raised questions about how someone with his past could hold boxing's most prestigious title. The sport had allowed fighters to compete with minimal oversight for decades. Liston's rise forced commissions to reconsider that approach. Mandatory pre-fight medical examinations became standard. Licensing requirements were tightened. Commissions began investigating fighters' backgrounds, health records, and eligibility before sanctioning championship fights. The changes weren't about Liston's skill, they were about the realization that boxing had no formal system for vetting who was allowed to compete at the highest level. What changed boxing wasn't Liston's dominance in the ring. It was the public discomfort with who he was outside of it. The sport couldn't justify crowning champions without knowing their medical history, criminal record, or connections. Liston's reign triggered the shift from informal acceptance to formal commission control. Boxing became a regulated sport with background checks and medical standards because Liston proved the old system was too lenient. Roberto Duran. In the 1970s and 1980s, Roberto Duran fought with an aggression that included every tactic available inside the ring. Duran would punch, push, elbow, and headbutt to control the action. He didn't just fight. He imposed himself physically in ways that blurred the line between legal and illegal. Referees were inconsistent about how to handle it. Some allowed the roughness, others penalized it arbitrarily. Duran's style exposed the lack of clarity in foul enforcement. The sport responded by codifying headbutt penalties and foul escalation procedures. Warnings became formalized, point deductions became standardized. Referees were given clearer instructions on how to handle cumulative fouls instead of relying entirely on their own judgment. The change wasn't about stopping Duran, it was about creating consistency in how fouls were handled across different referees and commissions. What makes Duran's impact significant is that he didn't invent rough tactics. He simply used them so effectively that the sport could no longer ignore the lack of structure around enforcement. Boxing became more standardized in how it handled fouls because Duran made it clear that referee discretion alone wasn't enough. The rules didn't change his style. They changed how the sport responded to it. Jack Johnson. In the early 1900s, Jack Johnson became the first black heavyweight champion and immediately shattered the assumptions of segregated America. Johnson didn't just win fights. He destroyed opponents with a level of skill and confidence that terrified the establishment. His dominance triggered a wave of regulatory changes designed not to protect fighters, but to control outcomes. The problem wasn't Johnson's technique. It was that he couldn't be beaten fairly, and the system couldn't tolerate that. Officiating standards were tightened. Neutral referees became mandatory. Commissions gained oversight powers they had never held before. The goal was clear: centralize control so that results could be influenced. Fouls could be called selectively, and Johnson's dominance could be contained. The reforms didn't work. Johnson kept winning, but the infrastructure they created became permanent. Early boxing commissions, standardized officiating, and referee intervention protocols all emerged during Johnson's reign, not because the sport needed them organically, but because Johnson's success demanded institutional resistance. The rules didn't stop him. They stopped the sport from being as unregulated as it was before him. What changed boxing wasn't just Johnson's skill. It was the system's refusal to let him dominate without interference. The sport became more controlled, more centralized, and more regulated because one man exposed how little control the establishment actually had: Jess Willard. In 1919, Jess Willard fought Jack Dempsey in Toledo, Ohio, under conditions that nearly killed him. The fight took place in extreme heat, over 100 degrees, with no medical oversight and no safety protocols. Willard was battered for 3 rounds in a fight so brutal that it shocked even hardened boxing fans. He suffered facial fractures, broken ribs, and severe dehydration. The lack of environmental consideration and medical intervention became impossible to defend. The sport was forced to respond. Heat safety protocols entered championship boxing. Medical personnel became required at major fights. Environmental conditions were considered for the first time in scheduling and location decisions. The change wasn't about Willard's skill, it was about what his suffering exposed. Boxing had operated for decades without regard for fighter health beyond the ring itself. The Willard fight revealed that external conditions could be just as dangerous as the punches. What changed boxing wasn't just the brutality of the fight, it was the realization that the sport's infrastructure was still trapped in an era that didn't account for basic safety. Willard's beating didn't create new rules about fighting. It created rules about the conditions under which fights could happen at all. Joe Louis. In the 1930s and 1940s, Joe Louis knocked out opponents with a consistency and power that boxing had never seen. Louis didn't just win fights, he ended them. The problem was that the equipment and safety standards of the era weren't built for someone who hit that hard. Glove weights varied, hand wraps were inconsistent, knockout stoppages were subjective. Louis exposed every gap in the system. His power forced the sport to standardize. Glove weight became regulated. Hand wrap inspections became mandatory. Referees were given clearer criteria for stopping fights after knockouts. The changes weren't designed to slow Louis down. They were designed to protect the fighters he was destroying. What makes Louis's impact so significant is that the reforms didn't limit his success. They simply formalized the standards that his dominance proved were missing. Boxing moved from informal traditions to codified regulations because Louis made it clear that power at his level required stricter oversight. Henry Armstrong. In the late 1930s, Henry Armstrong fought with a relentless pressure style that overwhelmed opponents. Armstrong threw punches and combinations, walked through counters, and closed distance aggressively, but as his style became dominant, opponents began holding, wrestling, and clinching excessively to survive. The problem wasn't Armstrong's approach, it was that the sport had no clear standard for separating boxing from grappling once fighters were inside. Armstrong's dominance triggered a formal crackdown. Excessive clinching was penalized more consistently. Wrestling tactics inside the ring were clearly defined as fouls. Referees were instructed to separate fighters quickly and enforce boxing as distinct from holding. The change wasn't about slowing Armstrong down. It was about clarifying what boxing actually was once someone made clinching the only viable defense. What changed boxing wasn't just Armstrong's aggression, it was the realization that without clear separation between boxing and wrestling, the sport could devolve into survival tactics instead of technique. The rules didn't stop Armstrong from winning. They stopped opponents from turning fights into grappling matches to avoid his pressure. Boxing became more clearly defined as a striking sport because Armstrong's style forced the issue. Mike Tyson. In the mid-1980s, Mike Tyson knocked out opponents with a speed and violence that boxing had not seen in decades. Tyson didn't accumulate damage, he delivered it in concentrated bursts. The problem was that referees were still operating under older standards for when to stop a fight. Fighters were allowed to take unanswered punches as long as they stayed standing. Tyson exposed how dangerous that tolerance was. His power didn't give opponents time to recover. By the time a fighter was visibly hurt, the damage was already done. The sport responded immediately. Referees were instructed to stop fights earlier. The tolerance for unanswered punches was shortened. Officials were trained to protect fighters before they collapsed, not after. Tyson's impact on knockout safety protocol was permanent. What changed boxing wasn't just his dominance. It was the recognition that waiting for a fighter to go down could mean waiting too long. The old standard had been to give fighters every chance to survive. The new standard prioritized health over warrior mentality. Tyson forced that shift because his knockouts made it clear that the old approach was causing preventable harm. Carlos Monzon. In the 1970s, Carlos Monzon dominated the middleweight division with a combination of skill and physical control. Monzon understood how to work inside, hold when necessary, and create angles that made it difficult for referees to see fouls clearly. His fights were clinical, but they also raised questions about when referees should intervene to protect opponents who were being systematically broken down. The issue wasn't that Monzon was dirty, it was that his dominance exposed how passive referees had become. The sport responded by increasing referee autonomy. Championship referees were given clear authority to stop fights early without waiting for visible injury. The emphasis shifted from allowing fighters to survive toward protecting them before irreversible damage occurred. Monzon's reign coincided with a broader shift in how boxing thought about referee intervention. The old mentality had been to let fighters prove they were done. The new approach was to recognize when a fighter was being systematically dismantled and stop it before it became dangerous. What changed boxing wasn't just Monzon's dominance. It was the realization that referees needed the authority to act preemptively, not just reactively. The rules didn't stop Monzon from winning. They gave referees the power to stop fights that earlier generations would have let continue. Riddick-Bowe vs. Evander Holyfield trilogy. In the early 1990s, Riddick-Bowe and Evander Holyfield fought 3 times in wars that redefined what the sport considered acceptable brutality. The second and third fights were especially punishing, with both men absorbing damage that would have ended careers in earlier eras. The problem was that there was no formal system to prevent fighters from immediately rebooking after brutal fights. Commissions had suspension authority, but it was rarely used consistently. The Bowe-Holyfield trilogy changed that. Mandatory post-fight medical suspensions became standard. Fighters could no longer take another fight days or weeks after a war without clearance. The suspension lengths were tied to the severity of damage sustained, not just whether a fighter lost. What makes this change significant is that it wasn't triggered by a single knockout or injury. It was triggered by the accumulated damage of multiple brutal fights in short succession. Boxing had allowed fighters to destroy themselves through scheduling. The trilogy forced commissions to intervene. Bernard Hopkins. In the late 1990s and 2000s, Bernard Hopkins mastered the art of veteran tactics. Hopkins would hold, lean, pivot, and position his head in ways that frustrated opponents and blurred the line between smart boxing and outright fouling. Referees struggled to manage him because his tactics were subtle, experienced, and difficult to penalize without appearing biased. Hopkins didn't break rules overtly. He exploited the gray areas. The sport responded by creating formal referee training modules on veteran fouling tactics. Holding, head positioning, and inside fouls became standardized enforcement points. Referees were taught to recognize the difference between defensive clinching and sustained holding designed to smother offense. Hopkins' style forced the sport to educate officials on what to look for and how to respond consistently. What changed boxing wasn't just Hopkins' success, it was the realization that veteran fighters had learned to manipulate officiating gaps that younger referees couldn't identify. Floyd Mayweather. In the 2000s and 2010s, Floyd Mayweather Jr. perfected a defensive style that included clinching immediately after landing combinations. Mayweather would punch, grab, and reset before opponents could counter. The tactic was legal, but it disrupted the rhythm of fights and frustrated opponents who couldn't sustain offense. Referees were inconsistent about how quickly to break the clinches, giving Mayweather a defensive advantage that compounded his already elite skills. The sport responded by issuing explicit directives to referees. Clinching after combinations was to be broken quickly. Warnings for excessive holding were to be issued earlier. Major commissions instructed officials to reduce tolerance for defensive clinching designed to stall action. What makes Mayweather's impact significant is that the rules weren't created because his tactic was illegal. They were created because it was too effective. Mayweather exposed how much control a fighter could gain by clinching at the right moments. And the sport decided that level of disruption needed faster intervention. Wladimir Klitschko. In the 2000s and early 2010s, Wladimir Klitschko dominated the heavyweight division with a style built on the jab, clinch, and control. Klitschko would establish distance with his jab, then immediately grab when opponents tried to close. The tactic was effective, but it turned fights into slow, controlled affairs, where action was constantly interrupted. Opponents couldn't generate sustained defense, and fans grew frustrated with the lack of exchanges. The IBF and WBA issued formal anti-clinch directives. Referees were instructed to issue quicker breaks and penalize excessive holding more aggressively. The goal was to force engagement and reduce the effectiveness of jab and grab strategies. Klitschko's reign triggered the most explicit separation timing rules the sport had seen in decades. Antonio Margarito. In 2009, Antonio Margarito was caught with illegal hand wraps before a fight. The wraps contained a plaster-like substance that would have hardened during the fight, turning his fists into weapons. The scandal was one of the most blatant examples of cheating in modern boxing, and it exposed how little oversight existed around hand wrapping. Fighters and their teams wrapped hands in private. Inspectors were inconsistent. There was no standardized protocol to prevent tampering. Margarito's case forced immediate reform. Hand wrap inspection became mandatory with commission supervision. Inspectors were required to sign off on wraps. Tamper-proof gauze protocols were implemented. The changes were among the clearest boxer-caused rule reforms in history. What makes Margarito's impact significant is that the reforms were immediate, universal, and permanent. Boxing had operated on trust for decades. Margarito proved that trust wasn't enough. The sport couldn't allow fighters to wrap their hands without oversight, and the new standards reflected that reality. Manny Pacquiao. In the 2000s and 2010s, Manny Pacquiao fought across multiple weight classes, often accepting catchweight agreements that required opponents to weigh below the division limit. The contracts gave Pacquiao advantages in speed and power while limiting opponents' natural size. Rehydration clauses were also negotiated, restricting how much weight fighters could gain back after the weigh-in. The tactics were legal, but they exposed how easily contracts could manipulate competitive balance. Commissions began scrutinizing catchweight agreements more closely. Regulations were introduced to limit extreme weight manipulation. Rehydration clauses came under review to prevent fighters from being weakened beyond the weigh-in. Pacquiao's career coincided with a broader shift toward regulating contract-based advantages that weren't explicitly part of the sport's rules. The sport began asserting regulatory authority over agreements that had previously been considered private negotiations. Deontay Wilder. In the 2010s, Deontay Wilder became known for one-punch knockout power that could end fights instantly. Wilder didn't accumulate damage. He delivered singular, devastating blows that shut opponents down immediately. The problem was that the neurological effects of those punches weren't always visible right away. Fighters would be conscious but compromised, and referees struggled to identify when delayed neurological damage required stoppage. The sport responded by emphasizing referee stoppage timing for one-punch punchers. Ringside officials were trained to anticipate delayed effects and intervene sooner. The focus shifted from waiting for a fighter to collapse to recognizing when a single blow had removed their ability to defend intelligently. What makes Wilder's impact significant is that his power forced boxing to reconsider how knockout damage was assessed. The old standard was whether a fighter could stand. The new standard included whether a fighter's neurological function was intact. Wilder's knockouts made it clear that consciousness alone wasn't enough to determine safety. Sergey Kovalev. In the 2010s, Sergey Kovalev fought with a body attack that consistently landed low. Kovalev's power made every punch dangerous, but opponents repeatedly complained that blows were straying below the belt. Referees were inconsistent about when to call fouls and how to escalate penalties. Kovalev's fights became case studies in how difficult it was to enforce low-blow rules when a fighter's power made every borderline shot consequential. The sport responded by escalating low-blow enforcement. Clear foul escalation procedures were implemented in championship fights. Referees were instructed to issue warnings faster and deduct points earlier when low blows were repeated. Kovalev's career coincided with a broader push to remove referee discretion from foul escalation and replace it with standardized protocols. Jake LaMotta. In the 1940s and 1950s, Jake LaMotta fought with a brutal infighting style that included constant head clashes and roughhouse tactics. LaMotta would walk through punches, lean with his head, and create collisions that blurred the line between accidental and intentional. His fights were wars, and the accumulated damage from head clashes and inside fouling became impossible to ignore. The sport responded by reinforcing fouling penalties and increasing medical monitoring. Referees were instructed to penalize head clashes more consistently. Medical personnel were given more authority to evaluate fighters between rounds. LaMotta's style forced boxing to acknowledge that damage could come from fouls as much as clean punches, and the sport needed infrastructure to address both. The sport couldn't allow fighters to absorb punishment from both legal and illegal tactics without accountability. The rules didn't stop LaMotta from brawling. They forced the sport to monitor and penalize the tactics that made his fights so dangerous. If you enjoyed this, I'm going to be posting a lot here, so it would mean a lot if you subscribed.